That's it, buddy. Nothing you change.
I'm rested.
You are talking about regrets, so if you want to ask about regrets, just ask about regrets and leave all this time-traveling nonsense out of it.
Okay, regrets. When have you ever changed your path? Hey, think on it.
We always end up having the same conversation, don't we?
Hey guys, Kiwi here, warning of spoilers for Breaking Bad, El Camino, and Better Call Saul. In this video I'll be breaking down each major cameo appearance in episode 613, the series finale of Better Call Saul. Like the video if you end up enjoying it, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Twitter for more Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad updates. With that being said, let's jump into the breakdown.
We could have split it 50-50. We could have gone home with $800,000 each.
Your point being?
Why didn't we? I know what stopped me. And you know what? It's never stopping me again.
We're sitting on $7 million here. I say we take it, split it 50-50.
You feeling right?
First thing we do, take $6 million and build a time machine. Those people that you're worried about, they would never find us.
So the episode starts with a flashback to Mike and Jimmy in the desert during Better Call Saul episode 508 Bagman, where they sit down after finding a water well and have somewhat of a heart-to-heart. Now, although Mike is one of the main characters of Better Call Saul, this still feels like a cameo since we've only had one short scene with Mike ever since his conclusion with Gus during episode 609. Not only that, but this is the start of the time machine motif that plays a theme throughout the entirety of the series finale. It's interesting how Mike is able to open up and attempt to have a sincere moment with Jimmy, but Jimmy isn't able to reciprocate. When Mike opens up, he mentions going back to stop his son's murder, but then he changes his answer to when he accepted his first bribe that turned him into a dirty cop. In a way, Mike accepting his first bribe was the first domino to fall that sent him down this long and tragic path. It eventually resulted in his son dying, which caused Mike to take up criminal work in Albuquerque in order to provide for his widowed family. I also love the parallel of Jimmy saying how they should just take Lalo's bail money, being a callback to the season 1 finale / season 2 premiere, when Jimmy told Mike that if he ever had a large sum of cash in front of him again, that he'd take it. Of course, we know that Jimmy doesn't take Lalo's bail money, but the fact that he considers it says a lot about his character and where his headspace was at up to and during season 5 of Better Call Saul.
They tell me they found you in a garbage dumpster. Well, that makes sense. No matter what they do with you now, no matter where they put you or for how long, it will never be enough.
The Marie cameo was incredibly unexpected, but it worked amazingly in this episode. It's funny how the creators didn't feel bad about spoiling the Walt and Jesse cameos because they felt like they had a lot more up their sleeves, and this was one of them, along with Chuck, which we'll discuss in just a moment. It was great to give the Marie character closure after all these years, something I didn't know I needed to see until now. It all starts off when Saul sees Marie on his way to his plea meeting, and he knows that she's behind the double-sided glass during the meeting. Saul suggests bringing Marie into the meeting because he knows that he can use her hate against him to his advantage. Bill Oakley explains how unreasonable it is for Marie to join the meeting, but Saul says that if all parties agree on it, that it's fine, undercutting the severity of the situation in just such a nonchalant way. It's interesting how even though this scene was filmed entirely in black and white, the creators made it a point to not have Marie wear any purple, which as we all know was her favorite color that she was obsessed about during Breaking Bad. The monologue that Marie gives Saul during this episode is possibly my favorite Marie moment out of the entire universe, and here's why. First off, Marie finds it funny how Saul was found in a dumpster considering she thinks of him as a trash person. Marie then paints Hank as a perfect person, which is not entirely true. He was a good person, but he had his flaws just like any other person in the Breaking Bad universe, or even in real life for that matter. It's understandable that Marie would want to put him on a pedestal, being the grieving widow of Hank and all, so it makes sense that she would point out all of his positive attributes while ignoring some of the negatives. This is especially true when you consider the fact that he died only just over a year ago, along with recently just being able to find his body and put him to rest a few months prior to this scene due to the deal that Skyler was confirmed to have made with the authorities. The point Marie is trying to get across is how great of a person Hank was, just to make Saul feel bad due to being associated with the people that caused his death, oh, and Gomez as well. Marie then insults Walt, which may initially be shocking to hear, but it makes complete sense considering how much we know Marie hates Walt since the end of Breaking Bad. In season 5 of Breaking Bad, Marie told Walt to unalive himself, which was yet another very powerful moment for Marie that goes into the running as one of Marie's best moments alongside inside this Better Call Saul cameo. I love the parallel between Marie being a genuine victim of the situation compared to Saul pretending to be. Actually, having Marie there makes the stakes of what's happening just that much more powerful, since she's actually lived through the events of Breaking Bad, as opposed to just being told what happened through the government speaking to Saul. Saul says how he's lost his profession, family, and freedom, and that he has nothing. Although that's true, as the saying goes, a man with nothing left also has nothing to lose. Marie and the prosecutor can tell that Saul is giving a sob story to gain sympathy while painting himself as a victim just like Marie, even though Saul is explaining an incredibly slanted viewpoint to the events that actually went down in Breaking Bad. And due to the previous Breaking Bad flashbacks, or the Walt and Jesse cameo along with Saul and Mike in his office, we know what truly went down, and that Saul actually instigated to work with Walt, something that he later admits during the court scene. Now, once Saul is called out by the prosecutor, his sympathetic demeanor fades as he begins to get inside the prosecutor's head about not wanting to lose a case, saying how he only needs one juror to believe him. Marie can tell these mind games are working on the prosecutor, and she tells him that he won't negotiate with Saul, but then we cut to her angrily walking out, implying how the prosecutor did agree to fold and work out another plea deal more in Saul's favor. I love how Marie tries to decide for the prosecutor that he won't make a deal with Saul. This is very reminiscent of Marie's attitude during Breaking Bad, where she'd sort of cross her arms and put her foot down on certain situations. Even though something like this would work on Hank, unlike Hank, the prosecutors play ball with Saul anyways. We also see Marie during the courtroom scene where Saul admits the truth about the initiative that he took to work with Walt, along with his involvement in the situations that surrounded it. Although Marie doesn't have a speaking role here, it's very powerful that she's in this scene to witness everything happen. This reminds me of Chuck's funeral from the season 4 premiere of Better Call Saul. During the funeral scene, there were many notable side characters there paying their respects, such as Cliff, Rich, Howard, and Cheryl. Even though most of them barely said a word, if nothing at all, the fact that they were there makes the scene so much more impactful, and the same could be said about Marie during this court scene.
Right. So you were always like this?
I love how the final Walt scene is an extension of the time that Saul and Walt spent together during the events of Granite State. Apparently, this was the first Walt and Jesse scene that they filmed out of all the cameos during Better Call Saul, which were all filmed in spring 2021 before the rest of season 6 was filmed. On the Insider podcast, they discussed how remarkable it was for Bob and Brian to slip back into their characters so seamlessly, which I'd have to agree. Bob Odenkirk also gave the insight that he was now playing Saul with the context of who he used to be as Jimmy, whereas in Breaking Bad that obviously wasn't the case. Although this is Saul in this scene, there definitely is the nuance of Jimmy as well, which wasn't necessarily there beforehand. There are brief moments where Saul shows his humanity during Breaking Bad, but those moments are few and far between. So the scene starts out with Saul being awoken to Walt trying to fix the faulty water heater. This is most likely a reference to the old water heater that Walt had in his Breaking Bad house for so long before he finally bought a new one with his drug money. Since Walt had most likely fidgeted with his old water heater so many times before eventually buying a new one, makes sense that he'd have some knowledge or at least confidence to fix the one in his safe room at Ed's. I love how much of a prick Walt is towards Saul and how condescending he is when Saul tries bringing up the time machine question to him. It perfectly sums up how rudely matter-of-fact Walt has always been. Instead of just taking the question at face value, of course Walt has to go off about how impossible time travel is, along with telling Saul to stay in his lane. Walt eventually recognizes that Saul is talking about having past regrets, to which Walt calls him out on it, and they have the closest thing to a heart-to-heart that they ever could. It's interesting how even though this is Walt and Saul's final time speaking to each other, neither of them can admit the truth of what's really going on inside them. They're reluctant to be honest with themselves about who they are deep down, what they've done that's gotten them to this point, along with what their true regrets really are. When Walt begins to speak of regrets, the camera pans down to the watch that Jesse gave him for his birthday. This does imply that Walt regrets throwing Jesse under the bus and having him captured and enslaved by Jack's gang. And as we see in the final episode of Breaking Bad, setting Jesse free is the final thing that Walt does, and it even gets him killed. Walt doesn't mention regrets about all the tragedy and death that he's caused along the way, or even losing his family. Not to say that Walt was happy with murder or pushing his family away, but it's the fact that he enjoyed being Heisenberg so much that he doesn't even acknowledge the consequences of what that brought with it. Walt instead brings up gray matter without mentioning it by name, but he explains to Saul how he sold his shares of a company that he co-founded, and that if he would have stuck with it, he would have been very successful legitimately. I love how Saul gets all excited about this by explaining how there's so many angles feels that he could have worked the situation, but gets instantly deflated by Walt telling him how he's the last lawyer that Walt would have went to about it. Saul then tells one of his quote-unquote biggest regrets, which is about how he biffed it too hard during a classic slip and fall con back in the day, resulting in his bad knees. Walt then tells Saul that he's always been like this, which again deflates Saul's mood, as you can see his facial expressions instantly drop from a smile to a frown. This isn't true, but considering Saul opens up about an early con that he did instead of something meaningful about his past, it makes sense that Walt would come to this conclusion. This hurts Saul, as it's the same conclusion that Chuck always had towards him, as Chuck was unable to ever agree that Jimmy could change.
Well, you could stay for a while. We could talk.
Talk? What about?
Well, your cases, your clients.
You want to talk about my clients? I'm gonna take a pass on the heart-to-heart, Chuck.
Now, speaking of Chuck, it was Peter Gould who felt like episode 613 was missing something and decided that the series finale needed a scene with Chuck. Apparently, they also had to completely rebuild the portion of Chuck's house that we saw in this episode, since the set was torn down seasons ago. It was very impactful seeing the return of Chuck in the final episode, as it wraps a bow around the story nicely by having it come full circle all the way back to the first season, along with the first 3 seasons, which I consider the Chuck era. This final Chuck flashback parallels his entire brotherly relationship with Jimmy that we've seen throughout the show. Normally, it's Jimmy who wants to show affection, care, and love towards Chuck, with Chuck brushing it off due to his lifelong resentment of Jimmy. During this flashback, we see the exact opposite. This is one rare moment where Chuck is able to put his differences aside and actually recognize that Jimmy's going out of his way to care for him, and he wants to show that he acknowledges that. Out of all the times that we've seen Jimmy want to have a heart-to-heart with Chuck throughout the earlier seasons, this is the one time that he actually could have, but he misses the opportunity never to return again. One of the constants throughout the episode is this idea of having a time machine and being able to go back in time to change something that you regret or missed out on, and I think that this scene with Chuck is implied to be one of the moments that Jimmy would have gone back to. During the scene with Mike, Jimmy's asked what he would go back to change, and then with Walt, he's asked what he regrets. With Mike, Jimmy just implies that he'd go and make himself rich, and he's unable to answer Mike when he's asked if there's anything he'd go back and change. With Walt, since his post-Breaking Bad, Saul doesn't necessarily wish that he was rich anymore, but he still isn't able to fully come to terms with his past or admit any true wrongdoings that he's been a part of. So Jimmy isn't able to answer sincerely either time, but I think the show implies to us his genuine answers throughout the episode. I think what he regrets most is messing with Chuck's insurance, and the thing that he'd go back in time to change would be to go back to this moment of the Chuck flashback and actually sit down with Chuck and have that heart-to-heart that he never did. This is clearly symbolized by Chuck picking up the H.G. Wells Time Machine book as he walks away, which answers the question of what the significance of that book was ever since we saw it during the first 2 episodes of season 6.
Slow down. You're gonna make yourself sick.
Oh, Christ, are you kidding me? Quantum mechanics? We're discussing that now? Stay in your lane.
What? I'm doing it.
Yeah, every day? While you're trying to start a practice? Why?
Why? Because you're my brother. Duh. You do the same for me.
Peter Gould compared the 3 cameo flashbacks of Mike, Walt, and Chuck to the 3 ghosts of Christmas past, since the creators always considered the progression of Jimmy transforming into Saul as a Christmas carol. Just like how Scrooge had 3 ghosts that changed his perspective on life, Mike, Walt, and Chuck definitely did the same for Jimmy, which all leaps back into the main story of the final episode, with Gene reverting back to Saul and Jimmy throughout the course of the episode, before finalizing himself as James McGill. Peter Gould continued to explain how it's not an exact analogy, but that Jimmy is trapped in a cycle and that each of these ghosts visiting him throughout the episode really emphasized that about him. Peter Gould, who wrote and directed this episode, admitted that he would have loved to have many other characters return, such as Howard, Hank, Skyler, etc., but didn't want to overload it with too many returning cameos. As much as I would have loved to see those characters return, I have to agree. I think that Peter found great ground with having these cameos show up in the final episode in such a way that relates to the story and overall plot of the show without overdoing it. I really loved each and every cameo during the series finale, especially since it added a lot of weight to the current Gene timeline story that was happening, which resulted in Jimmy finally being able to admit his regrets and get everything off of his chest that he'd been bottling up and compartmentalizing all these years. Let me know what you thought about the Better Call Saul series finale cameos in the comments below, along with any other subjects about Better Call Saul that you want to hear me discuss in the future. I'd appreciate a like on the video if you've enjoyed anything I've said today. If you're new to the channel or just haven't yet already, subscribe and hit that bell notification to stay updated on when I post new content on Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Check out my Patreon or give a super thanks to help support the channel financially. But most importantly, I thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
That's it, buddy.
What else?
For what? Money. You did it all for money.
A time machine?